Hello and welcome to Reaching for the Moon, presented by Everglades Moon Local Council, Florida chapter of Covenant of the Goddess. COG supports individual works by its covens, members, and local councils. It's a vibrant network of a myriad of Wiccan and witchy resources, religious support, friendships, service opportunities, and more. To find out more, visit our website, emlc.net, our Facebook page, facebook.com/EvergladesMoon, or Twitter, @EMLCTweets.
Hello everyone, this is Lady Bridget, and welcome to episode 22, our bonus episode for May 2016. Many of you have requested that we add the workshops from Equinox in the Oaks and from Turning Tides to the podcast. Some people because they were unable to attend these events, and other people because they went to one workshop and therefore missed the one that was running on the same track. So, in an effort to do that, today we're going to bring you the Herne Workshop, which was done by Canu at Equinox in the Oaks, and also, to break it up a little bit, because it is a very long 45-minute workshop, we'll bring you 3 songs by Emerald Rose from their album Bending Tradition. The first one is called Castle of Arianrod, the next one is Johnny Cope, and then we'll top it off with Lucky Man. And you can learn more about Emerald Rose from their website at www.emeraldrose.com. I will say this about the workshop. It is done outside. You will hear a lot of birds. You will hear some dogs barking. You might hear the occasional airplane going over. I've done my best to edit out most of the obnoxious noises. But remember, it is an outdoor workshop, an outdoor space. So just close your eyes and feel yourself out in the woods and listening to Canu's melodious voice, giving you more information about Herne. Enjoy.
I've been the highest and I've been the lowest. There is nothing that I cannot go. I am all, I am nothing, but I'll tell you something. I defend my chair as a pro. And I know the reason that way out of season plays Lutheran with the stone. I tell you these things, but how can I know I'm 3 times in the castle of Arianrod? We set forth like Arthur to reclaim our daughter, and the cauldron we lost in the trade. Atonement for insult resulted in tumult, the highest of prices we paid. We set forth for Ireland, we crossed to the other land. Our king was a bridge between worlds. I tell you these things, but how can I know I'm 3 times in the castle of Arianrod? When in the fire exploded their ire, ran poisoned a spear through the thigh. The cauldron was shattered, but nothing else mattered. We claimed it and fled with our lives. 700 set sail, but we 7 returned with the cauldron and the head of our king. I tell you these things, but how can I know I'm 3 times in the castle of Arianrod? The horns were hailing where Arthur lay waiting to rise up, hardy and brave. When the lance is forsaken, the sleeper awakens to take a sip from the rail. 700 set sail, but we 7 returned, with the cauldron and the words of our king. I tell you these things, but how can I know I'm 3 times in the castle of every emerald? I've been the highest, and I've been the lowest. There is nothing that I cannot know. I am all, I am nothing, but I'll tell you something. I defend my chair as a throne, and I know the reason that way out of season plays through the rain with a stone. I tell you these things, but how can I know I'm 3 times in the castle of every emerald? I tell you these things, but how can I know I'm 3 times in the castle of every emerald?
Okay, folks, well, welcome to this workshop on like antler and branch, right? Stuff about Herne. As I explained to my coven during a moon where we were talking about the personal deities that we work with, my gods are gods without words. And that's a little bit of a oversimplification of it, but Herne is not known for speeches he made, pronouncements, wisdom given, at least not in words. But there's a lot of things about the story of Herne and the actions that either he took or that happened to him that have really moved me and called to me from early on. I also work with the Green Man, and I see them as different figures. There's a lot of people who, in exploring the Herne or Green Man or Chrononos, other figures, tend to try and figure out what they mean, sometimes by associating them with other similar types of beings or stories or aspects that they may share with another being. And those are all legitimate exercises, but I also think that each of these things stands pretty well as its own being, idea, deity, however you want to approach it. I don't have a whole lot of real concern in and of myself to know what the right word is in dealing with these kinds of beings. But there's a few things that have been written about Herne over time, and the personal practice that I have has tended to deepen what is able to be learned from what was written. And Herne seems to have taken on a bit of a popular aspect in modern paganism. Lots of people who would say, "Oh yeah, right, Herne. I recognize that name," even though you don't see necessarily covens devoted to Herne or seasonal practices that are traditionally associated with Herne very much. But it really he seems to be catching something in the pagan imagination. And part of that has to do, I'm sure, with both the association with nature and with the wild hunt, which is a very engaging type of concept, almost overwhelming if you really get close up enough to it. And that's all well and good, because it is. The words that I'll be able to share with you, I hope, can give you a better sense of who Herne is, and more accurately put, I guess, who Herne was as well. Herne is said to have been a figure who was a forester in the area of Home Park, Windsor, England, during the reign of Richard II, I guess, in the 14th century. The area by then was a well-developed forest that was well-controlled in certain respects. Home Park is an area that the king had a house at and would come to for hunting and basically getting out of town, I guess, in some ways. And there's a number of people who were keepers of the forest in the Windsor area. And Herne was known to be a keeper who was very skilled. They often write about him having great hunting and woodcraft, but woodcraft, as it's termed at that point, was not likely to be carpentry as we know it, but kind of forest craft, in the sense of being very well connected with the forest, knowing its ways, its animals, its plants, and aiding him in being a really skilled hunter. The king got to know Herne by coming, and Herne would go out with the king and the other keepers on hunts. The king really ended up favoring Herne and wanting him to go on every hunt that he went out on, because he had really, really good juju for going hunting, and the king always likes to be successful. It's good to be king, but even better when the things happen that you want to have happen, including a good hunt. So the king would try and make sure that Herne was available to go every time. It was on one of these hunts where really the parts of Herne's story that I think bring us the beginnings of the really magical figure or deity that Herne becomes start to happen, because there's a stag that is spotted, and the host takes off after the stag. They're mounted on horses. They're not hunting from foot. And the king and Herne kind of start drawing away from the rest of the keepers after the stag. So they're a little bit isolated when the stag turns when he's almost cornered and charges the king. Gores the horse, and the king's thrown to the ground, and the stag is about to gore the king when Herne basically intervenes between them and takes the stag's charge and basically is gored mortally. So he's taken to the ground, and in the process, though, and in getting all gored and entangled with the stag, since he's a very good huntsman, he has his knife out and manages to actually kill the stag as they go down. The king is both grateful but also concerned about Herne. He's very badly wounded, and the rest of the host make their way up, and he realizes that he doesn't know what might be able to be done for Herne's wounds, but he asks the other keepers, can we help him? Is there something we can do for him? But they had grown really jealous of Herne's popularity. They thought that the favor that he was gaining in the king's eye was something that, they all wished they had too. And their envy basically kept them from doing anything to try and help Herne. And they told the king, we might, might as well just kill him off here, put him out of his misery. So you can tell he didn't have a great rapport with the other keepers at this point in his time, in part because of his skill and his success. This made the king even a little more upset and concerned, and a figure came out of the woods all of a sudden and approached the king. He's like, the heck is this? In some renderings, he's said to be a guy named Philip Urswick of Bagshot Heath. The king and his keepers were initially thinking he's a poacher, because these are lands that were generally kept for the king. Hunting deer was considered to be something that was a privilege, not a right, and the connection of sovereignty with the land at that time in England helped in a somewhat, I think, perverted way uphold that principle of the king's dominion over the land. But it's a development that I think perverted the earlier, more magically and spiritually centered practice, where the king didn't really have dominion over the land. It had dominion potentially over him. And the that relationship was the most important thing, not whether the king controlled the land and kept other people out and all that kind of stuff. But royal hunting lands and the stag have been associated with royalty and kings for a long time in Britain and in this area. That was true. So this guy coming up out of the woods, they immediately thought, he's a poacher. There's no reason to be in these woods unless you're here illegally and poaching. But the guy said actually he was skilled in medicine. He could help her. The king was a little encouraged by this, set aside some of his concerns about why the guy was in the woods at all. Said he would reward him, and also for any offenses he may have committed, since they assumed he had, pardon him if he could cure Herne. Urswick agreed, and he kind of started taking charge of the situation. Told the other keepers to cut the antlers off of and part of the top head off of the stag and tie them onto Herne's head, which they did, and to construct a litter for him so that he could be carried over to his small hut in Bagshot. With the king there, of course, knowing that the king really did want Herne to be cured if at all possible, brought back to life. The keepers were doing as told and helped Urswick bring Herne back to the hut. The king didn't go with him, though. And so when they were talking about him on the way and at the hut, Urswick quickly realized that these guys really didn't care for Herne at this point. They thought it'd be better for them if he had just died. And we're kind of hoping for that. So he had let the king know already, Urswick had, that he would cure Herne and have him back at work in a month's time. So there was a little bit of a cyclical period that was going to happen while whatever was going to go on with Urswick and Herne happened. But knowing that the keepers had their own agenda here, he asked what they would do for him if he aided them in their plot against Herne. And they didn't really have anything to give. These are guys who worked in the woods for the king, didn't have a whole lot of possessions of their own, lived in maybe a state that was well connected to the land, but not materially wealthy in any way that they could think of. They promised him that they would do whatever he wanted in return for helping, basically not return Herne to the position he'd been in of being like the primo keeper for the king, forester. And so, in return for their promise, Urswick agreed. He said that I told them after Herne's recovery, he wasn't going to be this great forester anymore. So they didn't have so much to worry about. They were going to be able to do their jobs and not be overshadowed by this guy. And so off they went. And as foretold, a month later, Herne returns to the castle home park, and the king receives him. He's really glad to see him alive. He looks, healthy, like he's really fully recovered. The king had rewarded Herne too for being such a great keeper with a purse of gold, moved him into the castle, let him live much more comfortably. But it soon became clear that in going out on the hunts, wasn't the forester that he used to be. As we might say in modern times, he lost his mojo. Something about it just wasn't clicking right. The king had promoted Herne to his head keeper already at that point, but basically ended up having to ask him to step down and not basically go on hunts with him anymore because he was kind of messing it up. Herne was pretty distraught by this too. The guy who really had a well-developed role by the time that this injury happened, and nobody relates that he had a big head about it, but he basically had really had a good thing going. And the loss of that really made him distraught. He ended up one night being reported to leave the castle, acting all crazed and riding off into Home Park with those antlers that had been tied to his head. And he was injured on his head as he went, and carrying two gifts that the king had given him when he'd returned. One was a silver horn, and the other was a golden chain. He had hunting dogs that some say left with him as well. So he rides off in this crazed manner into the woods, distraught with the state that he had found himself in. Later in the day, a peddler who was going through a part of Home Park found him hanging from one of the large oaks. Went back to fetch the keepers to find them and let them know. By the time they returned, he was gone. There was no sign of him. And that night, a huge thunderstorm came through, striking the tree that he'd been hung on, or that he hung himself on, and not killing it, but marking it deeply. And the renderings of Herne's oak, you can see one of these old renderings of it, make it look like it's got a great trunk, but probably went through some shit. Storms or lightning damage or other stuff, because it really is pretty gnarled, and some of these kind of woodcuts were done when it was even older than the time of the story, but it was clearly marked by the storm that came through after Herne's hung himself on the tree. And basically after that, though, each of the keepers that had conspired against Herne found themselves kind of worried about what happened, a little guilty about it in some ways, because the wish that they had really come true. But like many deals you make, that wish was something that also visited upon them the same thing they put out. So as time went on, they began to lose their forester skills, their own ability to have that connection with the forest and with the land diminished, and each of them became subject to the curse that they asked Urswick basically to visit on Herne, where he really was not recovered. So the king was getting pretty upset now. All his keepers at Home Park were basically gone to shit. This wasn't very good, and they really worried for their jobs and their lives. Kings are not very forgiving at times. So they went to see Urswick and say, hey man, this has gone all wrong somehow, but what can we do? And Urswick said the only way to remove the curse was to go to Herne's Oak at midnight. They had a lot of misgivings about this, but they figured they made the deal. They better go see what happens. And off they go. And Herne's ghost appears to them, complete with antlers, ordering them to return the next night with their horses and their hounds prepared for a hunt. And he disappears. Pretty chilling. But they figure, I don't know if it's going to get any better unless we do this. Someone's got to resolve this plight for them. They don't want to go on this way with the king's disfavor. So the next night they gathered at the tree, and Herne appears on his horse, antlers on his head, his horn and chain and his dogs, and tells the desperate keepers, off we go on the hunt, and leads them off into the woods. After they're deep in the woods, Urswick appears before them and welcomes Herne and reminds the keepers of their promise and commands them to serve Herne as his hunting party, as they'd sworn in their oath to follow the quest that he might make of them. So Urswick brings their own curse around to basically rest with them in a relationship with Herne that is known to then go on over the centuries. They tied themselves to something that they didn't know, and we're now going to be dragged through it, potentially forevermore. The stories that are told say that every night for a while, Herne called them to the Great Oak to gather and hunt in Windsor Forest in the nights, and the deer herds kept getting depleted more and more as the hunt went through the forest, until the king got so concerned that he ordered the keepers to come with him to Herne's Oak at midnight and get this matter resolved after they told him, we showed up and we'd taken this oath and we had to do, this druid guy says he would help us out with this, so they kind of confessed what happened to the king. So he brings them back to the oak at midnight. Herne arrives on his horse, and the king asks, what would stop these nightly hunts? Because at this point, things are really out of whack. Not just because the king's peace, but basically the land itself is being depleted and receding from its contact with humanity in a really basic way. And the king is smart enough to realize this and know that something has to be done. Herne gave the king his own version of what the keepers had done to him, and told the king that hanging the keepers on Herne's Oak would be the only way that the hunts would stop. And then he vanished. So the king hung treacherous keepers on Herne's Oak, and the hunts in the forest every night stopped, and the land was able to come back and plentiful in the way it was again. The king's relationship with the land itself was restored, and the treachery that the keepers had visited upon Herne basically was resolved in a tragic and violent way, but one that also basically just brought home the act that they put out in the world themselves. It said that after the reign of King Richard II ended, Herne and the keepers and the hounds would appear from time to time still, usually in the dark of night and most often kind of around midwinter. People would hear the baying of the hounds, and if they saw him, the story was actually that there was an owl that preceded them ahead of the hunt. But most of the time people relate hearing the hounds and the hooves and chains as the hunt would go by. It struck terror in people. They tell their children stories about a wild hunt as if it were the boogeyman that might come and take them away, and that they should be fearful of this event, in part because while the return of the hunt didn't necessarily have to do with the lands receding from humanity again, it was clear that it presaged things like somebody's death or a national disaster that was about to occur. This relates to a role in calling out of potentially great disasters, whether a personal death or something that may happen to the nation, that relates the wild hunt and Herne again back to that relationship with the land and the king, in the sense that the hunt itself is connected with that life of the land in a way that it would respond to try and make sure that it was known if there were danger. Or also in a role that is not well known, but necessarily intellectually, but I think is really clear to a lot of people about the wild hunt, which is that hunt is also a gatherer of souls. The figure that the wild hunt and Herne represent in many ways is the presage of a passage of one or many souls through the veil and to the underworld or to the next world, however you want to see it. And so people's fear of that unknown and the drama and real powerful events that formed the story of Herne and the wild hunt affect people deeply, even now. And while we celebrate the wild hunt as a fundamental symbol of that strength and wild nature of the land itself, I think one of the things that is very attractive in the pagan imagination is that it's also associated with the fact that it will come for you. You may not be ready, may not be calm, may not feel like it's your time, but that gatherer of souls, that dark rider that he's become, is inevitable. But his role is interesting in that in presaging death or disaster, people can be aware of that turn being taken or the event about to come. And it's interesting to me that hearing that hounds, the hooves, the horn, the chains, as they approach, are something that we do perceive, and that has something that I think is calling our soul. People who it may not be for are terrified because it calls your soul anyway, in part because our souls are inextricably connected with the things around us, with the land that bore us and that we will return to. So Herne as a figure has managed to go from a skilled huntsman into a huge figure in not just British mytho-history, but in the pagan community in terms of what force, and a really fundamental force, that he and the wild hunt represent.
From Dunbar, Charlie, beat me and you die, and I'll teach ye the art of war if you'll meet me in the morning. When Charlie looked this letter upon, drew his sword, the scabbard from, he said, "Follow me, my merry men, we'll meet Johnny Cope in the morning." Hey, Johnny Cope, are you waking yet? Are your drums a beating yet? If you were waking, I would wait to get to the coals in the morning. Now, Johnny, be as good as your word. Come try your faith with fire and sword. Don't flee away like a frightened bird that's chased from his nest in the morning. When Johnny Cope heard of this, he thought it would not be amiss to have a horse in readiness to flee away in the morning. Hey, Johnny Cope, are you waking yet? Are your drums a beating yet? If you were waking, I would wait to get to the coals in the morning. you waking yet? Are your drums beating yet? If you were waking, I would wait to get to the coals in the morning. Oh, Johnny, now get scampering, those Highland bagpipes make a din. It's best to sleep in your whole skin, it'll be a bloody morning. When Johnny called the Berwick cane, they asked of him, where are your men? The devil confound me again, I ken, for I left them all this morning. Hey, Johnny Coop, are you waking yet? Are your drums beating yet? If you were waking, I would wait to get to the coals in the morning. Hey, Johnny Coop, are you waking yet? Are your drums beating yet? If you were waking, I would wait to get to the coals in the morning.
It's something that called to me early on in my time in the craft, in part because I was slowly seeking ways that I thought male energy, male roles would be represented in the craft. And between Herne and the Green Man, I have a couple of things that I think balance interestingly, both in deep connection with the land and in connection with both the arising of life and its return. So for me, while either one can be seen to encompass the whole cycle, these two guys really balance my own sense of a lot of what I hope to deepen and respect and help embody in our pagan community, about the way in which male energy can represent both that arising, stewarding, and passing away. In many of our more Wiccan and witchcraft ceremonies, the cake's blessing evokes secrets and knowledge, the kinds of things that Herne had in spades when he was in this world. That deep connection with the land and the knowledge of what arises from it, the ability to work with it, and for human contact to not be in conflict with it. So it's one that for me developed, I think, rather naturally. There were some things written about Herne that people may have already discovered. Shakespeare had an entry in The Merry Wives of Windsor where it goes, there is an old tale goes that Herne the hunter, sometime a keeper here in Windsor forest, doth all the winter time at still midnight walk round about an oak with great ragged horns, and there he blasts the tree and takes the cattle, and makes milk kind yield blood, and shakes a chain in a most hideous and dreadful manner. You have heard of such a spirit, and well you know the superstitious, idle-headed eld received, and did deliver to our age this tale of Herne the hunter for a truth. Years later, there was something that was termed a pirate version of The Merry Wives that was put on, where an additional passage refers to him again and says, what shall he have that killed the deer, his leather skins and horns to wear? Then sing him home. Take thou no scorn to wear the horn. It was a crest ere thou wast born. Thy father's father wore it, the horn, the lusty horn. It's not a thing to laugh or scorn. And you see in here, not just the intellectual or wisdom keeper type of connection with the land, but that association across many cultures arising, that antlered beings have an expression of that cyclical virility of the land, of what might be sexuality in a way that arises in a very different manner than we would associate with, like Pan, who would be more playful at times, or even potentially more abusive of humans. Antlers will grow and shed every year, and they were seen by many peoples as an extremely magical event that would arise, be part a lot of times of the gathering and mating, and they drop off again until the next year. Herne's name itself is associated with some older languages in which H-U-R-N would mean horn, and peoples that came into eastern England, the Berkshires and things over time, included Saxons and other tribes that use those kinds of words for horn, and similar words, though, like kern, which means stone in a lot of older languages, so at least in some of the Germanic, Celtic renderings. So a lot of people associate Herne with Kronos because of that. both antler gods that tend to be seen as embodying connection with the land, especially animals. And Herne's stories got a lot of things that we could associate with deities like Kronos and Odin or Woden as well. So some of the things that I draw out of the surface of the story that we can see written about Herne and his tales involve parallels to Woden, like hanging themselves on a tree, it taking them basically into a deep connection with other world. For Herne, it was a restoration of a certain role and skills, but a totally otherworldly embodiment of it then. For Woden and Odin, stepping between those worlds by being hung on the world tree. Like Herne, kept him between the worlds forever since. Loss of an eye, in many ways, would be seen as basically having one eye in this world and one eye in the other. And being able to keep that connection is something that I think Odin draws on. And there's a couple other parallels, like riding Sleipnir across the sky and the guise as Eitridr, I think. I'm not sure if I'm saying it right, but there's a aspect of Woden or Odin where he basically rides across the sky with the warriors. And there's many renderings of wild hunts and stories throughout Europe. So it's something that arises not just with Herne in relationship to this kind of wild force and principle, but in a number of other cultures too. If you want to go into detail about the associations with Herne that cross culture and stories quite a bit, one of the only books I've ever seen on it is actually this one, In Search of Herne the Hunter by Eric Fitch. And he's got a lot of material in there that you can explore. I see value in. It also goes into such detail in terms of telling other stories that Fitch relates to Herne in sometimes marginal ways that I tend to recenter myself back into what I think Herne is, means, does, and represents more strongly. I think Fitch really explores a lot of other stuff and then comes back and just touches on Herne marginally. But it's pretty clear to me, in my experience, that the hanging on the tree and the antlered figure that Herne becomes under Erstwick's care is a passage into the other world, and antler represents that piercing of the veil, that outgrowth in this world of, at times, magical or sovereign power that has deep connection with the land, which in most respects many of us would recognize as also the underworld. So it's an arising of underworld powers, and Herne's own figure calls us to that type of reaction as he has crossed himself and calls at the crossing of others. Some of the tales that are told about how you react to the wild hunt if you see it are really interesting and instructive, because it can drive people mad and leave them in terror. But one of the things that's said, if you need to protect yourself from the hunt, is to go to the crossroads. And for a lot of us, we might think, oh, aren't you putting yourself right in the middle of that shit? But it's instructive that as really a crossroads figure at the intersection of the worlds, putting yourself right in it is kind of like being at the center of the storm, where if you center yourself in it, you're a lot less likely to get swiped by it going along. Although most people probably just hunker down in the house and try and hide under the covers until it's gone. But there's some interesting stories about salt and other stuff like that you can try and use if the hunt's coming by. I'm sure to try and put up a this world veil between you and it, or barrier between you and it, if you're hoping it's not coming for you, or trying to keep it at bay a bit. But a lot of us, I think, in the pagan community also have some sense that we may want to be taken by the wild hunt. It's instructive to know that that could be a dangerous endeavor. What I've experienced in the couple of times I've worked with that closely are what a lot of people would talk about in terms of being ridden or possessed. Something that is not calm and, definitely so hugely energetic that you can't really keep in one place. Like being drawn down, but like with a freaking fire hose. So it's an interesting experience that I think a lot of people feel that call of their soul to, because the wild hunt calls your souls. But it's also something, I think, to treat carefully, because it's a thing that's bigger than us, as a lot of our endeavors may be in the pagan realm. It's at least worth a short caution to know that if you approach something like the wild hunt with curiosity, that it may take more than you thought to offer. I'd like to do a little bit of a thing with us while we're together, a little meditative piece. Find a place where your body's comfortable. If you can and be comfortable doing it, rest your eyes closed. Let yourself hear all the things going on around us. There's a slight breeze across our skin. You can hear the air and the trees, birds, and figures all around us. The trees themselves give off a presence, standing sentinels on this land. And let your perception sink to the surface of this land. Through it flows an energy of plant and animal life beneath our feet. Let yourself sink down into that flowing energy of the land, and it takes us along like a gentle underground river. Gaining speed a bit. We wash through some turns, and up ahead, it drops us down further and washes us out, leaving us in a small glade with a well in the middle. The forest around this glade is dark, and while we can see, even our best perceptions don't take us far into this wood. A man comes forward, though, walking out of the trees. And he says to us, "There is a Herne. He walks the lands. He rides the hunt. He calls the souls. Each of us will come to him in time. For now, each of you have lives to live, friends to hug, dances to make, praises to sing, steps to take. But he will come for you and call you to his crossroads. For some in life, and others only in death." He puts his head back, cups his hands around his mouth, and sends out a call. And he sings, "Herne, Herne, Herne. Come in the quiet morning light, we feel your presence out of sight. Come, the sun has fully rose, your musky scent does fill our noses. Come, the daytime now is done, proud antlers hold the setting sun. Come, the moon is on the rise, a herd and pack go thundering by, of blood and life and death and all, of hoof and antler, bone and call. The wild hunt shall take us all. Herne, Herne, Herne. Out in the woods, you hear hooves, the baying of hounds, a distant horn and chain, rattling and riding, a host passing by. You can feel the ground move as it comes near this glade. An owl sweeps by, and then the host begins to recede. Away it goes into the deep, dark woods. And we notice as quiet falls around us again, the man is gone, slipped away. And as we each lean forward to take a small drink from the well, we tumble in, head over heels now. But supported, there's a rising tide, raising us back up, lifting us up through rocks and waters and soil, arising here in this place and land, and putting us back in our small circle here. Let yourself feel this place again. Remind yourself of the trees that stand sentinel on this land where we've gathered. Feel the land here beneath your feet, this world, and the fire pit in between us. When you're ready, move your fingers and toes and feet. Let yourself open your eyes and return here again. So the particulars of that are just simple because I wanted you all to have a centered experience, shifted a little, where that call and perception of the hunt going by might make an impression. For me, Herne is a figure that is inextricably linked with the coming forth of the underworld into this world and our passage back to it. His associations with stag and the lines that the hunt take in England are defined in relatively stable ways. And he may well be a modern figure that draws off of even older tales of like the trooping fae that would come down paths seasonally, potentially abducting people away into the other world or underworld. The fae themselves at times were reputed to ride stags, and Herne's association with the stag and potentially being an outgrowth of older tales of fairy kings and underworld beings that are present in Celtic mythology may be part of his background, I don't know. But I wanted to take the opportunity to share with you guys a little bit more about what I know of Herne and what my experience of him has been. And that invocation itself arose as I was planning to help with a ritual up in Starbridge Sanctuary in Georgia, where our coven was going, and we asked the people who live there, are there deities that you work with on this land? Because we're going to go do a main ritual on your land, and we'd like to honor the place where we're going. And they told us that they worked with Herne and Caradwin. And I started plumbing the depths of what I could about Herne. I'd already had a decent experience a little bit with it, but it was my opportunity to really delve into it more. And that invocation came out as a matter of planning for that ritual. First done in a natural amphitheater in the side of their hill, with about 75 people around, and I was nervous as shit. But basically had to just open the throat and deliver. And it rang through that little amphitheater like, oh, get out. And couldn't really walk away the same after that. I know we're just about at noon, and lunch is going to start. But I've done a lot of talking so far, and I wanted to also give time for people to either reflect and share experiences that they've had, or also as questions if you have any. Are there things that impressions that you've had about Herne, or why you wanted to come to a workshop like this?
I just wanted to learn about him. I had no idea he was so recent. I thought he was an ancient god. We considered him a god, though.
Names are a funny thing, you know. We know him in a name that seems to have arose from a historical figure, and not all that long ago. But everything I can find out about him relates to stuff that has played out in a number of cultures, at least across Europe, unless you want to really start broadening the association strongly, for a long time before that. The themes of a sacrificial king or leader, in some ways, restoring relation to the land for humans, whether that is actually a king or a proxy for the king, are much older. Lindau Man was probably in the 1st century AD, sacrificed as a young, healthy person who is well cared for into a peat bog. He had nice nails and everything, right? Had eaten a good meal before he was sacrificed. He was clubbed on the back of the head, his throat slit and garroted as well, and then put into the peat bog. And the sacrifice of a young, healthy person like that, got to mean something. Whether he was a prince or the king or a proxy for royalty, there's a lot of reason to believe that, whether actual or symbolic, that hanging or other sacrifice to the land has been an essential part of a much older, I can't say mythology, really, honestly. Mythohistory is closer because it's the way in which actual events are drawn into meaningful association for human communities. I think he walks right in a strong vein that preceded him, but also included him. And for me, it's a particular manifestation of that vein that called me really strongly. But I think he relates to, figures we call the Dark Rider, broadly to figures like Elegua, who is also a crossroads deity. Elegua, or Elegba, is that Santeria and Candomblé, voodoo type of figure your Orisha, Loa, that guards and controls the crossroads. There's a lot to be said about that, but that's a whole different workshop. Anybody else? Well, folks, I appreciate you coming. I hope that it was interesting and that you were able to learn a little bit more. A lot of people know some of the basic things, like Herne was sacrificed on a tree somehow. There's this hunt thing that developed, and I hope that you know a little more about his story and why he was considered to have a deep relationship with the land. And so what of it, this wild hunt thing that you hear about? Maybe it'll be a seed for more exploration or experience of it yourself. But if not, I hope that you're able to get something out of it while you're here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Before we begin our last segment of this episode, we'd like to thank you for listening. Putting a podcast together is a time-consuming labor of love, but knowing that someone is listening to our hard work and hopefully gaining something from it makes it worthwhile. Would you let us know you like the podcast by going to our website at emlc.net, click on the podcast tab, and write a comment. Tell us what you like and what you'd like to hear more of on our podcast. And even better, why not leave us a rating on iTunes? Ratings help us become more visible to more people. It's not about ego, it's all about service. Thank you, and blessed be.
All dressed in satin and waiting by the door. Ooh, what a lucky man he was. Ooh, what a lucky man he was. White lace and feathers, they made up his bed on a gold-covered mattress on which he was led. Ooh, what a lucky man he was. Ooh, what a lucky man he was. He went to fight wars for his country and his king, of his honor and his glory the people would sing. Ooh, what a lucky man he was. What a lucky man he was. Bullet had found him. His blood ran as he cried. No money could save him, so he lay down and he died.